You to awkwardly do that for a while. It'll be great. Okay, so we're going to talk about fasting and feasting. Is that where, I think we're to that part now. Am I forgetting anything? Okay, fasting and feasting. We're going to look at Acts 13 first, then we're going to go back to Acts 2. And all of this, again, is truncated in the gospel that we see in Acts 1, that this is not something that we earn. This is something that we do as a result of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. So let's talk about fasting. Three things before we start with that. This is the beginning of a conversation. There is absolutely no way that on Potluck Sunday, with everybody in here doing all these things over, we're in September, that means it's Labor Day, May, Memorial Day, September, Labor Day. There's no way that over Labor Day weekend, we're going to have enough time to talk about the significance of feasting and fasting and do full justice to both of these ideas. This is a conversation that we're going to start and that we can continue to have as one another, because I know that some people are like, yeah, feasting, fasting, all these things make perfect sense, and I've been discipled in this, and I understand this in a very biblical and theologically on point way. And then there's most of the rest of us that either have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, and that feasting even has any sort of spiritual significance, and have zero understanding of what's going on and what has happened throughout church history. And so there's actually a lot more to undo before we can really start to understand truly, right? And so we're just going to start that today. So there's much to undo. And so, which is the second point. Some of you in here, you have various relationships with food. You eat too much, you eat too little, you don't eat, and some of that is a biological thing, some of that is a psychological thing. There's all sorts of things going on in here. And so I want to be very careful with what we talk about today. And if this is a struggle for you, I just want you to know that we want to walk together in that. That's part of the fracture and the fall, right? And so we're not interested in putting a bunch of shame, or you shouldn't feel, this is something that we need to work through together. And all of this, whenever we think about any of the disciplines, anything that we do that help us to know and understand the Lord more clearly, it's always girded in the fact that we cannot earn grace, we don't earn this through these various behaviors. This is the way that we participate in and experience more clearly and just to different degrees. So, fasting. Let's check it out. Acts 13. If I can find my spot. All right, so they're all hanging out, and then they're fasting and they're praying, and they lay their hands on Paul and Barnabas, and they send them out. And what happens? I mean, one, we see this church is going out and they're supporting this group of people. Say, hey, you're going to go out, you're going to go on mission, and they fast. What is fasting? Let's start there first. Okay, and why do we do it? All right. Throughout the scriptures, three things, three different occurrences of fasting that we see, kind of that I think will be most helpful as we think about fasting today. So first fast. Anybody remember? Kids, do you remember? Can you think of a time when somebody didn't eat for a long time? Can you think of anybody in the Bible who yeah. Yes, Jesus is in the desert for 40 days. Can we think of, what's that? One more time. Yes, and Satan appeared, and Jesus was without food for 40 days. And then before that, there was somebody else. Does anybody remember that one? What's that? There's a lot of them, but there's two other ones that were like 40 days, no food. There's a dude named Elijah, and then there's this guy named Moses. And Moses is the first one that does it. And what I think is interesting about Moses and Elijah and Jesus is they do it all in response to something that God has done. They're not doing it in order to petition God. They're not doing it as sort of like any kind of vending machine Jesus sort of thing, but rather they've seen the glory and the goodness and the grandeur of God, and they're like, whoa. And it so overwhelms them that they don't eat for 40 days. And they're just kind of working through, processing, trying to sort it all out. And so I think that's something that, as I continue to think about what it looks like to fast or to not participate in something, to usually food, right? But it's fasting is not partaking in something. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's other things, but often it's food. This would be continued throughout the Old Testament from individuals. They would fast, but also the nation as a whole at times would fast, sometimes in response to what God had done, sometimes as a way of kind of just in light of the reconciliation that had happened between them and God, saying, hey, we've sinned, and so now we're going to collectively fast, that we would kind of come before the Lord that way. And then sometimes in petition, when they're going on a long journey, they would take a fast before they went out. Is fasting commanded? No, it's not commanded. Except one time. One time. The day in the Old Testament, the Day of Atonement, you were supposed to fast. One day out of the whole year. Now, by the time Jesus comes around, they're actually fasting twice a week. And it gets kind of weird because, Isaiah 58 comes in, and he's going to come in hot and heavy on the fast, because the people are like, oh, Lord, we're fasting, aren't we awesome, aren't we awesome? He's like, your fast is garbage. You're forgetting the poor. You're like, all the things that we were supposed to do in the festivals, you're not doing. All the things that we're supposed to do that would set you apart, you're not doing that. So you can do all the things that you want to do to try to manipulate me, but he's like, I'm not manipulatable. This is not going to happen. No, I want your heart. I want you to bend your heart. Okay, and so this continues. But apparently, after Jesus' day, the church thought this was a pretty good idea. They're like, oh, we're going to keep going with this twice a week fasting thing. And it actually happened throughout most of church history up until about the Enlightenment. Like, so if you were a Christian in, like pre-1800s, you probably would have fasted twice a week and nobody would have thought much about it. And if you were to get in a time machine and come to today, you'd be like, how are you all not doing this? And why are you talking about it? Like, this is just, it was so commonplace that they would take a time to abstain not just as individuals, but as a group, to experience the Lord more. And so what do? They're laying, so they fasted, they send the people out, and then what happens? They go and they meet this false prophet, and then Saul, this is where we see Saul becomes Paul, so new naming. I mean, it's just this radically wild thing that happens. The gospel is proclaimed, people come to repentance, and just as a result of a church fasting, praying, and sending people out. So let's just keep this in the back of our mind. And then as we think about why would we do this? Well, because I think laying down specific appetites reveals idols and what ultimately controls us. How many of us, when we start to thinking about fasting, we're like, well, I don't want to not eat. How much does what you take in control you? If I were to ask you to not do something else, like, what are the various structures that we put in our life in order to prop ourselves up and help us to move forward, which are sometimes very good, but sometimes those can ultimately control us, right? I'm really looking forward to the bike ride that I'm going on to later on this afternoon. But if I don't get to do that, am I going to come unraveled? If I do, does that control me in a way that isn't healthy and isn't good and is ultimately revealing idolatry? So we see that so is it a one-to-one? If we fast, then we'll go out and we'll be able to, get a new name, like, Saul will become Paul, and then we're going to preach the gospel, and magicians and things like that are going to come to a saving relationship with Jesus? No, it isn't. It isn't like that. God is not a vending machine where we do one thing and then we get this thing back out. But there's something that begins to happen and form and shape us within our soul when we start to say no to certain things so that we can say yes to other things. Let's talk about feasting. Let's flip over to Acts 2. So they devoted themselves to apostles' teaching, to fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayers, and awe came upon every soul. Many signs and wonders were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing proceeds as many had need. And day by day they were attending temple together, breaking bread in their homes. They received the food with gladness and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all people. And all the Lord added to the number day by day those who were being saved. So I get together with my friends and I have a cookout, and then everybody gets to know Jesus? Let's feast. Come on. Like, what? Yes. Yes. But again, there's some fracture here. There's some brokenness. Let's look at let's just talk feasting really quickly. Again, so there's 6 big Jewish festivals throughout the Old Testament. One of them was the Solemn Assembly. That was the Day of Atonement. One day that we're not supposed to eat food. The other times, Yahweh's like, yeah, this time of year, you gotta party. And then over here on this, like flip the calendar a little bit. Yep, party there. Party here. Do you know there's one that went for 8 days? 8 days. The whole country was like, we're gonna party. It had been like Easter and Christmas and the 4th of July for us all rolled into one thing for over a week. Can you imagine that? Like some of the introverts are like, yes, and it's my nightmares, right? Okay. But why? Because there's something that happens when we gather together. Kids, how many of you have been to a birthday party lately? Yeah? What do you like about birthday parties? I heard you get to spend time with your family, and I heard what else over here? Don't get shy now. I don't know. Cake? Cake? Yes! Of course you said cake. Why? Is cake delicious? Yes! Cake is awesome! Okay? And there's this really weird thing that happened. I don't really know when. Smarter people probably could figure it out. Most of you probably know when. But there was something that happened at one point in time where all of a sudden, like within Christianity, like we thought it was holier to just not partake in any of the good things and just like eat bland food and have lame celebrations, then wonder why nobody wants to get in on what we got. And I just don't see that in here. I see Jesus going around being like, you just see Yahweh who's, okay, we just got to talk. How cool is it that, okay, kids, what was can you think of a meal in a really early meal, maybe where somebody ate something they weren't supposed to eat? Does anyone remember that story? There's two people, their names are Adam and Eve, and they eat something they're not supposed to eat. Does anyone remember that story? You remember that story? You remember that story? Yeah, who are those? Yeah, what happens? They eat the wrong fruit, and then they don't get to hang out with God anymore in the way that they were designed to. And how cool is it that despite the fact that we succumb to our appetites and say, yeah, Lord, I know that like you told me not to do this and you gave me a good outlet in which to, kind of put this appetite into play, but I have this desire and this appetite in me and I'm going to exercise it this way, even though it's contrary to what you're saying and what you know to be good and how I've been designed. How cool is it that God's like, yeah, I know that you ate of the fruit and you're going to have all kinds of baggage around that and there's just going to be all sorts of things going on. How cool is it that the Lord's like, yeah, and one of the places where I'm going to meet you is at the dinner table. How cool is it that God's like, yeah, I know that like one thing we could do is just say, okay, you never get to eat anymore and no more fruit and blah, blah, blah. But no, what does the Lord do? He's like, no, actually, it's really, really important that you as a very peculiar and different people who are weird in all the right ways, you've got to know how to get together with one another and do this the right way. Just because you didn't do it once doesn't mean we're not going to do it anymore. It just means that we're going to practice it more often and you're going to need more help. And so even the festivals, right? We look at the Jewish festivals. Who's there? They've got priests who are there to help them understand what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do these things in a specific way so that they can enjoy the communion with the Lord that he has granted to them. And so as a result, he says, yeah, feast. Feast for 8 days. They would even have like a special savings account in the temple so that people that had lots of money could come in and be like, hey, I know that guy over there doesn't have a lot. And so I just want to make sure that he's covered. Like, can you imagine a time when we all got together and it wasn't just like, no shade on the Costco burgers. I dig them, right? Like part of it was partially my idea that we do that. So I'm not anti the Costco burgers that we're going to serve or like the whatever. But imagine if like once a year we went and we went down to Thielen's and we're like, hey, we need the ribeye. And then we got some of those dry age bags and we dry aged the steak so it was just like tender and juicy and delicious. And if you're a vegetarian here, just whatever the comparable is, imagine that. And vegan, same thing, right? But just for me, this is where I go with this. And then And then if somebody who never, ever, ever got to enjoy that type of meal, and they're like, hey, I don't know that I can pay. I mean, how much, like, we get to see that picture of the gospel right there, where it's like, no, it's already been covered, it's been paid for, and we all get in on this together. So come to the table. Don't let anything be a barrier to your communion with us. How much better a feast is that than when we do that alone, or we do that in separation, or we do that to say, oh, I deserve better, and I deserve this, and I'm, like, all the different ways that we feast, and all the different ways that we take meals and food and the glorious provision that the Lord has given to us, and we twist it. And I think the Lord is just inviting us back into and showing here in Acts 2 what happens when we feast with one another in appropriate ways. When we get together and we share a meal. I think it helps us to be reminded of Genesis 1, the communion that we have in the Lord. And it reminds us and helps us to remember that what we've been created for and what we'll ultimately be back with in Revelation 22. I just love that we bring in fracture with our relationship with God through a meal. And he says, hey, let's redeem that and let's all get together for dinner. And there we have Revelation 21 and 22. So four things just to hit on here. I think it helps us with, so fasting and feasting, I think both help us to understand resistance to the ways of the world and also the blessings of God. Obedience, let's talk about obedience and talk about suffering. How many of us, we need to be trained to obey God? How many of us just, hey, kids, how many of you think it's really easy to follow all the rules? Do you have any kids that find it really easy to follow all the rules? I was not one of those kids that will put my cards right on the table, right from go. Is any kids you find it easy to follow all the rules? You find it easy to follow the rules? I bet. That's probably true. Yeah. But for most of us, it's kind of tough to follow the rules. We have to actually train in that. And I think that sometimes fasting and saying no to certain things helps us to train to that and builds our ability to do that. And then as a result, and then sometimes it's tough. Like I've done some things where you train and training is difficult. And when you don't do something that you really like to do, that can be tough. But it's interesting that when you do those things that are difficult like that, the way that enables us, if I say no to the things that are good for me and are allowed to me, it strengthens me in my ability to say no to the things that are bad for me, right? And then provision. We get to understand God's blessing when we participate in a meal. What does it look like to take a meal and to sit down and just realize that, man, without this food, without this very simple food, like you think about really at the end of the day, how simple is food? Like it's kind of basic, right? I mean, like the fact that you can be sustained by milk and cereal, I mean, not for long, right? And especially not the really brightly colored stuff, but like the fact that you can start your day with milk and cereal and like be relatively functional for a while, like that's all it takes, I think reveals, to me, it just reveals like, oh my gosh. And then when you don't do it, like anybody, like if you fasted before or just maybe by accident, like you've skipped a couple meals and then like later on in the day, like we've talked about Megan's checklist for me, like is he hot? Is he hungry? Why? Like that's usually one of the two. That solves most of the problems, right? So it's like, that should just show and reveal to us like the fragility in which we operate and the dependence and the need that we have for God, and that he is so graciously granted us, right? So that we're not earning his favor, but it's been granted to us by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And then as a result, enjoyment. Just the fact that God says, hey, I'm going to give you all kinds of different things to eat. Like he could just give us like this, like the future space movie things where it's like you just have a space pellet and you eat it and then you move on, right? Or if you're an endurance athlete, like some of the stuff that we consume where you're like, this is not food. This is just chemical fuel and I don't even know why I'm eating it, right? But that he's like, no, I'm going to give you taste buds. And then I'm going to get people like the creative, did you know that like George's son makes this pizza that has figs on it? It's terrific, We made it like a demo for it for my neighbors the other day. They're like, I don't know, pizza figs seems weird. They ate it. They're like, this is fantastic. Why? Like God's like, yeah, enjoy this stuff. Because he's a God of enjoyment. And he needs us to do that. And there's a right way to do it. And it's a way that we can do that it just like compels people forward and just that has it so that day by day they're attending temple together, breaking bread in their homes, receiving food with glad and generous hearts. I mean, how many of us sat down, and maybe this will be something we can do if, in a few moments, but we'll sit down for a meal with glad and generous hearts, where we're glad that we've received and that we have received that turns us to being a people who are generous, moving outwardly. Okay. Let's pause here and let's have some story time. Andrew and I were chatting about this a little bit earlier this morning, and I just said, hey, maybe you can just tell the story. And so, Andrew Dirks, come on up here, and maybe this will provide a little bit of a break. The kids, you can get up and get the wiggles a little bit.
You keep calling it story time, but I don't know that there's stories. Don't be disappointed. But
Andrew, tell me the story of your experience with, do you want to share?
no.
Okay, yeah. With fasting, and you have 3 things that that stick out to you, but just tell us a little bit of the story of your experience with fasting.
Okay. So for Crosby Small Group, we've been just studying different disciplines or practices of Jesus and just like what that looks like. And so last fall is when we started looking at fasting, and it just like hit me like a ton of bricks. And in particular, not like sending out Paul and Barnabas, where it's like there's this specific thing we should like pray and fast about that. Because I had done that and didn't know why, or like I don't know, like whatever. But then looking at more like all throughout church history, people have routinely made a part of their weekly practice to fast, and so that really intrigued me. And so just looking at that, I think the thing that stuck out to me was I had been told these like quippy lines like, God hears you when you're hungry, which just isn't true. I mean, he does, but he hears you all the time. It doesn't amplify whatever. Or
You mean
even
fasting isn't a megaphone for me to get?
right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, give me this. Yeah, it's just
Okay.
yeah. And even things like I get that when you're hungry, you're like you get reminded like, oh, I'm hungry. I should pray about this thing. But that's really cerebral still, and that there's more to that. And so just changing that kind of narrative of like, oh, I'm hungry. I will pray about this now. What was helpful for me was to instead start saying, and this just was the idea from someone else, was like, God, like I'm hungry and I want food, but what I want more than food right now is for, and then fill in the blank. And for me, like I teach in Crosby, and particularly my students and my coworkers have just really been on my heart, but also just seeing God transform the whole community. And so just to become that just like routine thing throughout the week, that when I'm hungry, I'm like, yeah, God, but what I really want is to see you move in these kids and these students, to really see you transform this community. And then that became so routine that even when I wasn't fasting, just when I was hungry, God, I want to see you move in this community. And I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never had conversations in the quantity or quality that I've had this year until I started. And I didn't even see it until afterwards, looking back on the year and be like, wait a second. I started praying regularly and fasting about God moving in this school, and he has been, and it's just been amazing. So that would be one of the things, just looking at that.
And it wasn't immediate.
And it wasn't immediate, no. And it was terrible at first. It was like I'm designed to eat, as all of us are. But I think like for me, like so. I think what's amazing is the simplicity of it is that I decided to skip breakfast twice a week, and that's like all I could handle. And like I'll talk to Matt. Oh, he's gone. He's like, I forgot to eat till dinner. And she's like, how do you do that? I would just be so miserable. But I love that God can take such a little thing and do such a big thing with it. Is like it's just breakfast. Like some people just don't eat that because they just don't.
It's kind of a dovetail into another thing you told me about.
Yeah. Yes.
But
and no, just that in that simplicity, like it was horrible at first, but it became routine, and it was the long-term thing that actually started to make a difference in my thinking and seeing what God was doing. But yeah, and then another thing that was just super helpful to be explained to me is like look at who Jesus was with, and the poor and the outcasts and the needy and the broken, and it's a way to like grow in compassion and empathy. And so again, just the context is me looking out at my students, and you have a snow day. Most kids are like, yeah, snow day. Some kids are like, shoot, I was going to eat lunch at school and I don't have food anymore. And to like understand that cognitively is one thing, but to be like, or a kid comes late to class and just, that means they did not get breakfast. And now you're expecting them to like think about like doing stuff and be like, okay, I actually know what it's like to skip breakfast. I know what it's like to be hungry. And I have a headache when that happens. And now you have a headache and I'm asking you to learn. And just like seeing that, just again, it's not just like a one thing. It's like just over the course of time. It's being like, yeah, there's like an ache there. And understanding that's happening to kids in my classroom and like growing in empathy and compassion for them.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty fast. I'm just hearing and thinking about like how can we quickly get rid of right and entitlement, which is something that's I think just so baked into who we are as Westerners.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
to then increase, as you said, empathy and compassion. Yeah.
And not a shot against like the Western church or whatever, but I don't spend enough time like really in the trenches or like living life with people who are not like pretty well off,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so just a way to like tune my heart out of just like being comfortable for those who aren't. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the third thing too is like, I told Mike this morning, I'm just like, I know that I've like played in punk rock bands and whatever, but I like don't identify myself as being punk rock until you start to like give me a reason to like push back against Satan. And I'm just like, let's go. Like, let's just floor that dude. And I just think that there's this thing about like the pressure of just society and the world and just sin around us to just, there's just this thing that just creeps in on us so unnoticingly. And just that way of like, oh, I need my desires fulfilled. I need, I just want to do what I want to do when I want to do it or whatever. And to be able to just like push back and resist against that and just like fight the devil with like, you know what? I'm not going to eat right now. What are you going to do about it? You know? And I think that, I mean, you just mentioned like being able to take away something that I am allowed equips me to fight something that I'm not allowed to do. Right. And so just be, it just tunes our ability to like, when there is that thing of like entitlement or like lusting after something or like I just spend and I can't get my budget under control or whatever, like being able to have that thing where it's just like, no, like I'm training myself, I'm disciplining myself, my body and my mind, and like I'm saying no to these things brings the other stuff under control. And you can just like look at that thing and be like, I see you, lust, or whatever it is, and like, and I'm looking the other way and I'm looking at Jesus because I'm training myself to just look away from that and not be influenced by that. Yeah.
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 Further thoughts?
Only that if it's some, like I spent years and years and years like knowing about fasting in the church. And I was just like so put off by it and I didn't understand it. And so if it's something that like you're continuing to be like, yeah, I don't get it. Like I get that. And I would just say like go slow to go fast. Like this is something that has, like imagine like being a Christian and like not praying. Like, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't pray. Like that would be weird, right? And like this is just something that has so transformed me that I'm never going back. It's just like I can't not. This is just gonna be a part of it. And of course there will be seasons and it will look differently or whatever. But like it's worth taking the time to like just go slow and understand what it is and like read some books, have some conversations, do some talks, listen to some podcasts, whatever, and like understand it and incorporate it slow. The first podcast or whatever series listened to was like the director of World Vision talking about like this 21-day fast. He's like, you got to do it. And I'm like, no, I don't. Like breakfast is enough. Like, you know, and it's almost a year and I'm still just trying to figure out how to just do breakfast. And so don't go just dive so in and burn out. Go slow to go fast, and just like figure out it bit by bit. And the whole, if it's something that's rubbing you the wrong way, the whole point of there is that you're leaning into it already. You're like, wait, what is this? And I would just like say like, okay, embrace that and figure out what it is. How does it work? And I mean, it's potluck. I'd love to talk with people about it. And there's great resources and stuff to just understand it more and approach it the right way and not just jump in because some guy on stage said he did it. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So there's something that happens when we fast and we feast that doesn't happen when we don't. And I think, as Andrew said, we begin to participate with and experience the Lord in the entirety of our being, not just in what we think and what we feel, which is what so often we reduce the faith to. And so, yeah, and I think just practically moving forward, if you're like, what do we do as a result? If you feel compelled to fast, be obedient to that right away in the ability that you can, right? That, I think, yeah, don't compare yourself to the leader of World Vision. Like, I'm going to go 21 days, no food. I've been, gluttonous for the last, however many decades of my life. Certainly, if I just cut this off, it'll be radically transforming to me. It might. It might just be horrible, though. I don't know. And so that's a conversation with the Lord. And the reason that Andrew and I have this dialogue here is so that we can, this is what we need to do this. This has to be in dialogue and in community. And so maybe talk with somebody else, talk to Andrew, talk to myself, talk to others and go, hey, I'm thinking about this. Do you want to join in? Do you want to get in on any of this? Because if you fasted and you fasted with other people, that can be a really formative experience, right? And so I just say, yeah, just do it. And to wherever the Lord has you, that he would continue to equip and grow you in this. And if you're like, absolutely not, no way, hey, cool, we'll keep talking about it. It's fine. This is not a commandment, this is not a must, but this is something that we see that, boy, it happens, and then wild things happen after that. And it isn't the cause, but there's something in there that's worth us looking into. And then on the element of feasting, like when you sit down and when you're with others, like take the time to pause, to recognize your finitude, your fragility, and then as a result, the abundant provision and blessing that the Lord has given you. The fact that we get to go out today and eat food. If you're here today and this is like the first meal that you've eaten in a while, like, we are so glad to feed you. And then we get to come together and we get to learn how to feed and nourish one another. And so it's my prayer that we would be ever glad and gracious and generous as a result of our time with one another, and that would inform the way that we gather and meet with each other as we go, just throughout the week. So, kids, y'all been great. We're going to take some time, and yes, we're going to take some time, and we're going to be quiet.